Hey, it's Clay. Welcome to another League of Legends video. This is going to be a 4.2 patch analysis for League of Legends, the newest patch, the second patch in the 2014 season. Let's go ahead and get into the champion changes right here and focus on those. So first up, Xerath got a rework. Now, the Xerath rework, I think, is pretty interesting because, as you can read in the description, and my understanding of Xerath pre- and post-rework is that the focus here is to really hone in on his identity as a long-range siege champion, and not kind of as this weird long-range burst champion who had a ton of magic penetration and long range. And it was weird because, he was strong. I don't think that Xerath was not really overpowered or underpowered. He was, reasonably strong, but it's more about, making him a more fun champion to play and a more fun champion to play against. So, I think that this is I think he is deserving of a rework. He just wasn't quite the champion that he could have been. So, anyways, let's get into his skills and abilities. His passive was completely changed. His old passive used to give him armor per ability power. So when he built ability power, he got a ton of armor, which was very strange because he's this very long-range mage who wants to stay in the back. That'd be really neat on somebody who's like an assassin who kind of wants to dive in and be in the mix. But it was just kind of strange, and it didn't really make sense with his kit. Now his passive basically is his mana sustain. Every 10 seconds, his next basic attack will restore mana based on his level, and then effect damaging an enemy champion with your basic attack will double the amount of mana restored. So this actually could be quite nice. I'm not sure if this will be enough mana regen to allow him to forego a mana item. So a lot of mages these days will rush Athene's Unholy Grail. Tear is still something that gets bought. Morellonomicon, all those items kind of fill the same role in that they allow you to have some mana sustain, and you can use your abilities pretty frequently even if you don't have blue buff. So I don't know if this will be enough to allow that to happen, but it will certainly help with his mana sustain in lane. It's possible you could do something like a double Doran's Rings right into Deathcap. I imagine that could actually be a very strong build on Xerath, but Athene's is still a pretty strong item as well. With Athene's, you probably would have almost unlimited mana with his passive up. So, overall, I think this was a good change, and just definitely something that's much more useful for a mage, long-range mage, than his old passive. Next up is Q. They actually made some interesting changes to his Q. They kept its core identity as this long-range lined skill shot that does damage to everything in the line. And they also kept its identity as something that has a variable range. Before, you would have to enter into your W, which would root you, and then you would gain a lot of bonus range. But now it's this. It kind of reminds me of Varus's Q, where when you hit Q, you charge it up, and as you're charging, the range will increase. So overall, quite a cool ability. The initial range is only 700, which is very short, but after a 1.5 second channel, you go up to 1400 range. Now, instead of being rooted, you are just slowed by up to 50%. So overall, some nice changes. I think this is a really cool direction to take his Q. It kind of gives you a little bit more, counterplay in the fact that when you see Xerath slow down and you can see him when he's charging up, then you're going to probably need to dodge. But at the same time, it's still quite useful because it doesn't root him in place, so he still does have some mobility at least while he's charging up his Arcano Pulse. So overall, I think this was a nice change to the spell. It also has more damage. I don't remember the exact numbers. I believe it used to have a 0.6 AP ratio. So overall, definitely going to deal a little bit more damage here with the 0.75 AP ratio. And I think overall just a nice change. I think this will be a better Q than his old one. Next is his W. This was changed completely. It used to root him in place and then give him free magic penetration. Now it is like a single charge of his old ultimate. So his old ultimate gave you 3 charges of this ground circle AoE magic damage that you could fire off in rapid succession. Now he gets a single charge of that on his W, and this has a bullseye mechanic where if you're caught in the outer radius, you're dealt significantly less damage and slowed only by 10%. But if you're caught in the middle, you take significantly more damage and are slowed much more heavily. On a 10-second cooldown, 1000 range. So overall, just a very solid standard spell. It also gives him a pretty solid on-demand slow, and it again rewarding you for good accurate play. Lining up your W is definitely going to be really nice to get that bonus damage. It's going to be pretty important. And I could definitely see this being the spell that he would max second, just because it has pretty high base damage and a nice high AP ratio if you do land the bullseye. Next up would be his E. This has also completely changed. It used to be a targeted ability, and then if you landed another one of Xerath's abilities, it would stun. Now it stuns on its own, and it's just a lined skill shot. The damage is a little bit low, the AP ratio is a little bit low, but the stun, interestingly enough, will actually be between 0.75 and 2 seconds, depending on how far it travels, so max range stuns are going to be better. And the cooldown is around 11 seconds at max rank as well. So with his basic abilities, there's definitely a lot more variance. Before, his only combo was E, W, Q, kind of, or maybe, mix in your W wherever you want, if you can W, E, Q. But basically chaining his E into his Q was really his only combination. And if he didn't really have his ultimate, he didn't really have much kill potential. But now, between his Q and his W and his E, he has one more damaging spell. Before his W didn't do any damage. So, kind of interestingly enough, he probably has a lot more pressure in lane, a lot more wave clear, just a lot more tools to deal with the situation. And some good changes there. And then the last change will be to his ultimate. I think this was probably the most interesting and probably the most tinkered with change. But this is a really interesting ability. So Xerath will root himself in place and gain 3 shots of Arcane Barrage. So this is kind of like a mix of his W and his old ultimate. Now, this is very, very long range. In the 3 charges, the damage is listed there. Let's see here. And then the real big kicker here is that look at this range. So 3,200, 4,400, and 5,600. This 5,600, that is pretty much almost as similar to Ziggs's ultimate and also Twisted Fate's ultimate. I believe that those are both around 53 or 5,500 range. So we're talking about an ability that if you kind of move into the bottom brush in mid lane, you can reach the bottom lane. So very, very interesting. I am very interested to see exactly how this works in terms of the mechanics. I'm not exactly sure. But overall, very interesting ability. And definitely something that can, allow Xerath to kind of play almost a little bit like Karthus or Ziggs in the fact that they can just kind of sit in mid lane, use their spells to impact other lanes, but still kind of stay in mid lane and be this constant long-range poking, sieging type mage. So overall, I'm actually quite excited to see Xerath. I think that he could be a very powerful mid laner. I think, has some similarities possibly to Ziggs. I would imagine his wave clear is really good between his Q and his W. He's got some nice crowd control with his W and his E. And then his ultimate gives him this tremendous range. And so very interesting changes to his kit. I also think that we could possibly see Xerath as a support. I don't think he'll be amazing at it, just because his E is his crowd control, and it's not really the best ability, but he would have nice poke, he would have some nice slowing and stunning going on. It probably would be really similar to Lux in terms of her ability as a support. So definitely something that could work, but overall, some nice changes to Xerath, and we'll see how it works. Next up will be Skarner. Oh, I didn't actually want to do that. So the Skarner changes. I actually am not as familiar with Skarner. I have not played him very much, but I'm going to do my best anyways to talk about some of these changes. So first up, his base attack speed was lowered a little bit. Next up, his Q. So one thing they did is they increased, they gave it attack speed that stacks up to 3 times, and they took away the slow on his Q. So I know his Q is kind of like his low cooldown, spammable bread and butter damaging ability. And moving the slow means that he no longer has a perma-slow. So that's something to keep in mind. Next up is W, Crystalline Exoskeleton. So they lowered the cooldown a little bit, which is nice, but then they also increased the movement speed and increased the base shield. So that's really nice. But then they took away the attack speed bonus, moved it to his Q. I think that would be a nice change, just because before, if you broke through his shield, then he was kind of worthless because he did not have the attack speed. But now he has greater movement speed and also greater shield, so it's just going to help him a little bit better, be a little bit stronger. He's got a little more power in his W. Next up is his E. I believe this ability used to be kind of worthless, but now what they did is they put the slow and they increased the range. So, this ability actually has quite a bit of use now. Now it has longer range and it's got this potential to AoE slow. So you trade this kind of single target perma-slow on his Q to this more long-range AoE line skill shot slow. So I think that's kind of interesting. And then just some quality of life buffs to his ultimate. I don't know enough about Skarner to say if this is good or bad changes, but I guess we'll just kind of see. I think Skarner was pretty underplayed, so a change probably makes some sense. And also, Permaslows just don't really have that much, counterplay, but, also giving some power back on his W, I think, is probably the key to really maximizing him and having success. So I guess we'll just kind of see how that works. Now moving on to more minor champion changes. Ashe, they changed her Hawkshot. The big kicker here is that you get 3 bonus gold at all ranks. This is generally a 1-point skill. I know there maybe are some Ashes who will max this kind of like second-ish or something, but generally Ashe is probably her weakest skill. So giving you more bonus gold at rank 1 is definitely a nice change. But then the cooldown is 60 at all ranks, so that's a little bit of a nerf. I think overall this is probably a buff to her, just going to give her some more gold to help her ramp up more quickly. Ashe has almost 0, 100%, she has 0 steroids, damage steroids, so all of her damage comes from her itemization. And so, very item reliant in terms of her ability to deal a lot of damage. We all know she has a ton of utility. Her ability to initiate team fights is really high, but this will just kind of help her ramp up faster, get more gold. You're going to have 1 point in this for most of the laning phase when you're farming anyways, so I think the 3 bonus gold will be nice. Changes to Mundo's Infected Cleaver. I was curious to see how they would change Dr. Mundo, and I think this is an interesting direction. So they're making the missile width thinner. So basically, this has 2 things that I would notice about this. I've played Mundo quite a bit, and first of all, during the late game, in the middle, during team fights especially, it's going to be a little bit harder to land cleavers on opponents that know Mundo and know how to dodge. So if you have opponents who are trying to juke you out, it's going to be a little bit more difficult to land those cleavers. So again, you're going to separate good Mundos from great Mundos. That's 100% true. However, there are times during the laning phase when I'm playing Dr. Mundo when I have really felt annoyed with the width of the cleavers because, you use your Q a lot to farm creeps, especially in bad lane matchups, and there have been a lot of times when if there are 2 creeps standing right next to each other and one of them is slightly forward, but let's say the one that's behind is dying faster, it's impossible to actually get to that second creep because the one in front will block it because the width of the cleaver was too wide. So in some ways I actually will kind of enjoy this change for farming, but it definitely you will miss a little bit more of your cleavers in the late game. But overall I think a nice change to Mundo. They didn't actually change any of his numbers or his power. He still has his core gameplay as this unkillable tank. They're just kind of making his cleavers a little bit harder to hit. So a good change here, and hopefully he won't see as many bans, so hopefully I can play him some more. Evelynn has been in a very, very bad place since her last change. They lowered the missile speed on her hate spike, her main damage, and they changed her E to physical damage, so her standard build kind of became outdated. Now, they're kind of reverting a little bit her hate spike change. They're adjusting the missile speed so that the closer they are to the target, the higher the missile speed will be. So it has a higher initial speed that will rapidly decay as it travels. So I guess we'll just kind of see how this works. Evelynn is a tricky champion to balance. And really the thing about Evelynn isn't so much, I've always thought, isn't so much her damage, it's her stealth. Her passive is really what makes her scary. Her ability to enter into ganks that are so optimal because your opponent has no idea that they're coming. That's what makes Evelynn strong, and not necessarily because her damage is so OP or anything like that. So I guess we'll just kind of see how this works. I haven't actually played much Evelynn since the change. There are other junglers who have kind of come more into favor, but I guess time will really have to tell how this works for Eve. Next up is Kayle. Kayle, I would say, got a pretty massive nerf. Kayle has been seeing a lot of play throughout, all elos, and especially in competitive. Her ability, especially once she gets Nashor's and Lichbane, those 2 items just allow her to have tremendous burst damage, and she scales extremely hard into the late game, and she also brings a ton of utility. So a very strong pick. Now, they basically, what they did is they took away a ton of her scaling on her Q, and they shifted her power into her W and her R, which is her utility-based abilities. Her Q is her main nuke. It's a targeted ability. It used to have a 1.0 AP ratio, now has a 0.6. So they're reducing the scaling by ability power by 40% on her Q, which in my mind is a massive nerf. Especially because Kayle is so dependent on Lichbane Like I said, all the good kills will build a Lich Bane as one of her core items. Lich Bane scales off of AP, so the best way to scale your damage is to get the Nashers, get the Lich Bane, and then go for hard ability power. You're seeing kills build Death Cap, DFG, Void Staff to get so much damage out of her Q and her E. And so their goal was to reduce her upfront burst, which they definitely did. But I think that a 40% cut in AP scaling is really hard. This really hits her very, very hard. Now, to compensate for this, they are increasing the heal AP ratio from 0.35 to 0.45, and they're also giving it the ability to scale with ability power. So the move and speed buff will actually scale. So if you get a lot of AP, it's kind of like Lulu now. She's kind of becoming quite a popular pick, especially in mid lane, because her speed boost and her ultimate scale so well with ability power. And then they also reduced the mana cost to 0 on her ultimate, so you can always use it when it's off cooldown. Personally, I'm really sad to see this. I think that I understand that Kayle was really, really strong, and that her burst is really, really hard to deal with, but I think that this change was too harsh. I mean, taking 40% of her damage scaling away and only giving her back at 10% with a speed increase and no mana cost. Like these buffs do not offset this nerf, and this really puts Kayle in a bit of a bad spot. Now, I'm curious to see if perhaps we will see different Kayle builds. Kayle is somebody who can go AP, AD, or hybrid. She has AD scaling on her Q. She has AD scaling on her E. But the AP build has definitely been hands down the strongest lately, so I'm very curious to see if maybe a different build will come up and be strong. I'm not really sure, but I'm a little bit sad to see this change, and probably not going to be seeing Kayle in the competitive scene anymore. I feel like 0.4 change was too much. Why not try it at 0.8? Why not try it at 0.75? This was just a very heavy nerf. 0.6 is a poor AP ratio. Very, very below average. I mean, I realize 1.0 is too strong, but find something more in the middle. 0.6 was just too much. Now, Riven, giving her a little bit of more tweaking from the last patch when she got a fairly big nerf. They're lowering her base health regen. So, and then they are also increase her base shield. So, by, I believe, 20 points all across the board. So, basically, Riven is more reliant on her shield for tanking and sustaining damage. Overall, I think this is a solid change to Riven. Good Riven players use her shield very effectively. They're probably going to see this as more of a buff. But this is going to hit her lane sustain, so against very high sustain opponents like Mundo and Warwick, etc., it's going to be a little bit hard for her to stay in the lane as long without a lot of lifesteal. So I guess we'll just kind of see, again, how they continue to tweak with Riven. I think that this is really important, that after Riot makes a change, that they continue to follow up. So like with Kayle, if this turns out to totally gut her and nobody plays her and her win rate plummets, bring this AP ratio back up a little bit. Do things to continue to develop champions in their balance rather than one and done. Flame Spinner got increased particles. Thresh's basic attack was lowered by 25. This actually will be a moderate nerf in some lanes, but not so much in others. Against other melee supports, this won't really be a big deal. But against range supports, like specifically Annie, this actually could feel a little bit difficult. But overall, I think a nice change. Thresh is so strong that, it's almost one of those things where he just receives nerf after nerf after nerf, but just his kit itself is so powerful that it almost doesn't matter what you nerf of him. So I guess we'll just kind of see, but Thresh is still going to be just as strong as ever. Yasuo got toned down a little bit. Yasuo's had a weird life. When he was released, his win rate was extraordinarily bad, like 30-some%, like as bad as you'll ever see. But then people figured out how to play them, and he got a quality of life buff in patch 4.1, and now he is very strong. He's banned very frequently, and just a very powerful champion. And they're kind of doing quite a number of things. The biggest changes that I can see is that they're changing his passive a little bit, that he's not going to be able to generate flow as much, and his flow is his passive really is the key to his kit. It gives him the double crit, which is the core of his damage, and then it also gives him his shield. His shield is really strong. It's a very powerful shield, and if you can use it effectively in fights, it's going to be really hard to deal with him just because he gets a lot of free defensive stats. And this combination of mobility, a ton of damage, as well as shield, it makes him really hard to deal with. So not allowing him, both with his E and his passive changes, he's basically not going to be generating his shield as often. I think is a very core change that he definitely needs. Also, the range on his ultimate was lowered as well, so just kind of some toning him back in line with, I think, where he should be now that people know how to play him. Ziggs, my boy Ziggs, I have been playing a ton of Ziggs. He really fits my playstyle in mid, and he's very, very strong. Now, basically, they're tuning him down a little bit. They're hitting his passive, so the damage on his passive is going to be less at early levels, and then they're changing his E, his explosive minefield, so that it doesn't clear minion waves quite as ridiculously strong as it does now. So, I definitely recognize that Ziggs is extremely strong. He is a very powerful champion. You know, his passive nerf especially is going to really hit his early harassment. You know, when I play Ziggs, every time my passive comes up, I make a note to try and harass my opponent with a Q auto attack, and that's really the best way for Ziggs to gain lane control. So I guess we'll just kind of see how this affects him long term. But this is definitely going to hit his early harassment. And then his E, his Hexplosive Minefield, is just so powerful at pushing minion waves. I still think that he'll be strong because his Q is also a core part of that. And that was not touched, but definitely toning down his power level a little bit. I still think that he's going to be very strong and probably played quite a bit, but just not quite as overwhelming in terms of his wave clear and his harass. Now, I'm not actually sure if any of these more minor things, I mean, these are all very, very minor things. So, oh yeah, the Perseverance Mastery was nerfed quite heavily. If we look at this, it goes from 2% down to 1%, so this is like cutting it in half. So champions who rarely rely on the Perseverance Mastery, like some of the big tanks in top lane, are going to feel this a little bit. But overall, I guess we'll just kind of see. I don't think, I mean, a Mastery change isn't too big of a deal. This Mastery was, I think, too strong, so bringing it more in line. Turrets were changed a little bit, so yeah. Anyways, that's it. So anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this change. I'm really excited to try out the new Xerath Raric personally, as I think he could be a pretty fun champ that I would like to pick up. But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below, and I'll see you again soon. Bye.